2012. Welcome back, everyone, from our little recess. We'll be taking public comment on any items that anyone would like to speak on that are on the agenda today, so please fill out a card and bring it forward if you'd like to be heard, or general public comment. Likewise, please fill out a card and bring it forward. We as of now, have no general public comment cards, but if we get them, I'll go ahead and take those at the end of the regular agenda. We have two items on today's agenda that I would propose as consent items. Those are items 7 and 9. Unless, Mr. Englander, you have... I
agree.
Okay, I'm joined by Mr. Englander today. We will not have Mr. Kretz or Mr. Rosendahl here, as I understand it, and Mr. Cardenas will be with us momentarily. So I think what we'll go ahead and do is proceed with our closed session items now. So we're going to take items 1, 2, 3, and 4 in closed session. So if you're not here on those items, well, actually, why don't we go ahead and go? Yeah, we'll move it. Yeah, we'll move it into the back room. So shouldn't take too long. If you're here on other items, please just relax here. We'll go ahead and move into the back room to proceed with our closed session items. I had proposed that items 7 and 9 be consent items, and we now have a quorum, so if there's no objection to those items being approved.
Which items?
7 and 9. Okay, without objection, those items are approved. That brings us then to, is Mr. Santana here?
He stepped out, but if you'd like, we go to item 5.
Okay, then let's go ahead and, well, that's going to be a long one, I think. Why don't we go ahead with number 8?
8. Okay. Item 8 is a city attorney report and ordinance submitted in response to motion Garcetti Rosendahl Labange relative to amending section 21.41 of the Los Angeles Municipal Code to address the classification of internet businesses and remove sunset provisions that currently apply.
Good afternoon, Valentin Dino, City Attorney's Office. In accordance with the Council's instructions, in this case we have drafted the ordinance before you today, which simply eliminates the 2 sunset clauses in question, which simply means that the ordinance will basically continue in its unabridged form for until otherwise modified.
Okay, so the original motion in this matter by Mr. Garcetti and Mr. Rosendahl called for the Office of Finance and the CLA and the CAO to report back with an analysis of the effectiveness of the original ordinance to attract and retain internet-based companies. Is that report available to us now? Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Melissa Krantz, Office of the CAO. At this time, there is no report. I could say that the office does support any changes that would be targeted towards those businesses that are leaving the city, or to attract new businesses, especially those businesses that generate revenue. However, in the case of this particular proposal, the elimination of the tax means that we wouldn't be able to increase that tax at a later date if that is necessary. So, of course, in order to preserve revenue, we would not be in favor of outright elimination.
Right. Well, I have an initial concern about that impact, that if the sunset is removed, we do run the risk of requiring a voter approval in the future. But aside from that, the motion called for an economic analysis, and I don't have an economic analysis, so how can we be asked to remove a sunset on something that we haven't yet had the opportunity to analyze whether it's even been effective?
Right, that is correct. So we would have to provide an analysis.
I would propose that we hold this matter in committee for at least 2 weeks so that we can consider the merits of the economic analysis in the first instance. And I'd like to have that before us as soon as possible.
I would also ask that with that, since the classifications yet haven't been completely realized, in other words, we're not sure exactly what an internet business might or might not be, as that's an emerging and changing category, that we look at the idea of also bringing back not only what was the recommendation from the chair, but the idea of extending instead of the elimination of the sunset.
Yeah, that would be, it would be useful to have that option before us as well when we have further consideration.
And then
of it,
since I may or may not, I'm going to be gone for one meeting, I think, and so in case it does come back while I'm out, just to note that looking at piecemealing sort of different categories, and I know we did one recently on a piece of legislation that I authored on auto dealers, and but the idea is we're having a holistic discussion on the elimination and phase out completely of business tax. And so while we continue those discussions, I think a lot more of these will be coming through in terms of categories, and making any decision categorically on elimination rather than sunset. I think we do have to look at the whole phase out as a plan, but a financial one. And without having that data back yet, we should bring all that together at some point. So I just want to note that for the record, my feeling on that.
And on that point, just so I'm clear, you know, I think that many of us see that there's value in a long-term plan for reduction or elimination of the business tax, but we also are very, we also all have to be very cognizant of the fact that that's a $400 million hit to the general fund that we need to figure out a solution for. And I know BTAC has made a number of recommendations that suggest that there will be additional revenues that will be derived as a result of the elimination of that, and that may be the case, but they won't be derived in year number one.
Right.
And so our challenge is, I think, to have targeted, initially targeted relief that we have a high level of certainty will return, will produce returns in other areas of revenue. And that's why this economic analysis of the existing success of this is really important to me, because I'm not interested in just doing the piecemeal approach that Mr. Englander just described unless we know that that piecemeal approach is actually maximizing our opportunity to produce increased revenues. And I think there's ways that we can do that. If you target specifically the industries that are most likely to leave, that are on the verge of leaving, that have the greatest, for which gross receipts are the greatest impact on their siting decisions. You know, if you take all those factors into account, we can have targeted strategies like the automobile dealers, which was, I think, an effective example of that. So if we can do some things like that, and maybe this is one of those. It's just that without an economic report, I have no idea whether it is. It's just anecdotal if I don't have economic analysis.
Absolutely agree. If I could ask, and that's, I'm glad you made those points. When the economic analysis comes back, if we could, if there's a way to split up what is received in sales tax from those internet-based businesses through the next law versus what's not, what's service-related, because there's a lot of service-related type businesses now online as well, and these are all lumped into one. So if we're looking at, well, what's the generation back to the general fund, or what is it we're going to be retaining besides obviously good jobs? What are we getting back financially, because it's a financial analysis? Categorically, what are those that are actually selling goods, and are those goods being shipped at or manufactured and or shipped out of LA? If there's a way to do some analysis on that, I think it'd be helpful.
Yes, Sarah Kachanian, Office of Finance, Tax and Permit Division, Chief Tax and Compliance Officer. One of the exclusions under the internet-based business classification is actually the sale of tangible goods. So if you have a taxpayer coming forward that is under retail or wholesale sales, and we review their application to determine if they qualify under the category or not, they will not be qualified for internet-based business.
So it's strictly service-related?
Well, initially, Office of Finance did do an estimate on specific NACIS codes, on coming up with a projection on what would be the revenue impact. But in terms of making projections for the future, it'd be difficult to do that because you have new businesses coming in and requesting for the classification, as well as existing businesses who have various of classifications that they can be under. It could be a retail sales. They can be under retail sales or multimedia coming forward and requesting for the
Or it
reclassification.
could be a professional as well.
Or it can be a professional, correct?
So there's, and again, with all of those things changing at light speed, I think we've got to tread lightly and make sure that we are business friendly. And that's why the idea of perhaps extending a sunset while these things change and emerge and definitions are changing and defined. We can figure that out. So we'll wait for
Okay.
the report. Thank you.
One thing, council member, I believe that there is an economic analysis already that was prepared by the Office of Finance about contemporary with the request, which was in '09. However, it needs to be updated anyway, and it clearly is not before you today, is not in the file, so I'm sure they'll
Yeah,
prepare another one.
So when would we be able to get something before us?
You mean the
I know you
existing
can't
report?
speak because it's a group project here of CLA, CAO, and finance, so I'm not sure if you can unilaterally speak to it, but if there's something that's been completed, but that was completed
Couple of years.
before we enacted the actual previous ordinance, so if it was 2009, that was before we enacted this. That's not useful. It's actually whether we've made progress in achieving our goal with the ordinance. So has that been done? Yeah.
No, it has not. I believe that was what you were asking
Okay.
for with the economic analysis.
Okay. So we'll hold this over for 30 days then, and we'll see what progress we've made at that time, and we'll keep holding it over until we get it.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
okay.
Thank
You
you.
very much. All right.
I'd like to go to item 6.
Yes. Yes, Mr. Santana's here.
Item 6
So let's
is a
go to
CEO
item number
report.
6.
Relative to the results from the 2012 tax and revenue anticipation notes.
Mr. Santana, welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Good to be back in the new fiscal year. Where it's rare that I'm up here giving good news, but I'll be happy to give it to you this time
Can we
around.
please have order in the room? Mr. Santana has good news.
So, in relation to our TRAN for this fiscal year, the city did incredibly well, much better than we had anticipated. We were able to sell 1.26 billion in notes at 20 basis points, which is a historic low for us. We did well last year at 26, and we beat that. It's important to note that we remained in the same neighborhood as the County of Los Angeles that often brags about how well they do. So it was, but I wanted to share this in context of how this was done, and it really gives us a sense of how we proceed in the future. It starts with the work of this committee. You know, part of the challenge that we've encountered over the last 3 to 4 years has really resulted in this committee taking on some very difficult issues and making some very tough decisions. And those do not go unnoticed. When we met with the bond rating agencies in preparation for this TRAN, it was very clear that they follow the work of this committee and the work of the council very closely. They asked some very difficult questions about our long-term strategy to address our structural deficit. They raised some concerns over the fact that we're anticipating a shortfall next fiscal year. I mean, not next fiscal year, but also within this fiscal year. There was concerns at the time about the uncertainty that remains around the CRA and the funds that we anticipate in the budget, as well as ambulance billings reimbursements. But in all, their assessment was that the city has made progress, and as a result, we received the highest ratings from all 3 agencies. If you read their reports, they read much like a to-do list of things that they will be monitoring us closely on, and issues and areas of concern that they anticipate progress. And just to give you an example of how closely they watch us, that during the time the TRAN that we were there, a meeting with them, and they were preparing their report, there was a discussion at the council about the business tax, and and the potential elimination of the business tax. And the discussion of eliminating the business tax made it into one of the reports. Obviously, a concern that if we eliminate $440 million, even in a 15-year period, the city would have to then find alternative revenue to replace that or make corresponding cuts, knowing how difficult that is. They're not going to opine as to whether it's a good decision or a bad decision to take on such a difficult issue, but they are watching our actions closely and will comment on it as we move forward. The work with our rating agencies doesn't just end after we receive a rating. It should be noted that as a result of the bankruptcy announcement of San Bernardino and a number of other cities in California that are on the brink of bankruptcy, we have received additional questions from the rating agencies wanting to make sure that they understand exactly how the city is doing. They obviously get pressure from investors who are asking them, and so they will continue to ask us about our future finances and the deficits that we know we're going to be encountering. And we're actually in the process of responding to that now. It also, the fact that we did so well also speaks to work that my office did to make sure that investors understand that there's more going on than what they read in the headlines. We had a historic investors conference that we brought in over 200 investors and bankers from around the country. They came in and had a full-day conference at LA Live, two-day actually, partnering with our sister agencies and the proprietaries, the school district, the MTA, which was very successful by the feedback that we've gotten both by the investors and the banking community. And then we also did a very aggressive outreach through a roadshow. We spent 2 weeks traveling to them versus usually what we do is we host a luncheon in New York and they all come in. We actually went from Baltimore, Philadelphia, New Jersey, New York, Boston, Chicago, San Francisco, and the surrounding Bay Area, and met directly in their offices, spent 2 hours with giving them a presentation, of which is part of the attachment that we included, responding to specific questions and concerns, responding to concerns about potential bankruptcy, which they've all would have a hard time asking in a big group, but we're very frank in asking it privately. And then we also walked them through something that we did differently this year, an analysis by economist, Chris Thornburg, that gives a story about how the LA economy is doing. And that's something that they constantly have asked for. The data that we generally provide is general to the county. It's hard to really get specific data on the economy of Los Angeles as a city. We tasked Thornburg to do that, and he was successful in putting together a very thorough report on the strengths and weaknesses of our economy as a city, but also contrasting it to the surrounding area. And overall, the outlook is that we're on the mend and we're getting stronger, where some other parts of the county aren't necessarily heading in that direction. So combined with all that, of course, we also did so utilizing a small minority-owned firm as our underwriter. Our principal senior underwriter was being managed by Luke Capital. This was a huge undertaking for them, and they performed phenomenally well. They were aggressive. They made sure that investors were properly informed. They were effective in negotiating rates, as well as, ultimately where we ended up. And so, it's one of course, our task is to make sure that we helped smaller firms grow, and this by far was a successful example of how we could do that, and at the same time be very competitive in how we do as a city in terms of the overall ratings and rates that we received. So this is some good news that we're proud to share with the committee, and a good model for the future.
Thank you. Mr. Cardenas.
Thank you. Well done, Miguel, and congratulations to your team and the growth that I've seen on your team over the last 10 years. When you say it was sold at 2 basis points, if it were, say, a basis point higher, give us a perspective. What cost is that to the city if it were 1 basis point higher?
I mean, it's in the range of hundreds of thousands of dollars. So to give you an example, when we did the TRAN just a few years ago.
There you go. Okay.
Yeah. We were at, I believe is, I'm sorry, do you have this?
50,000.
Yeah.
It's like between 50 and 100,000
Per basis point. Right, but
per 0.1 basis point, right? Because it's 20, which is 0.2%. So if you had another 0.01, it'd be additional 50 to 100,000 depending on the maturity.
But to give you an example, I'm trying to find that. We did a comparison of how we did compared to a few years ago, where we did, we issued less of amount. Do you have that?
Back in 2009, we issued about 975 million at like 1.54 basis points, and the interest cost was about like 14 million. So on the average since then till now, interest cost was like 7 million to the city. This year, the interest cost to the city is $2 million.
Okay. So it shows how dramatically different that is.
And there's a lot of reasons for that. One of them.
Exactly. It's not just one factor.
No.
But I just wanted to point out that I think today we have large firms that do business for the city, and yet smaller and medium firms. But I think the aggressiveness of wanting to do the best job possible, I think is better today than it was 10 years ago. And I'm not saying that the firms 10 years ago weren't good. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I think the word on the street is that LA is giving small and medium firms a chance to show their stuff and to work our paper and to sell our paper.
Loop is a medium-sized firm, and they had the capital to be able to take 50%, and that's where the rub is. So over the last 10 years, as our program has grown, and a lot of these smaller firms have become medium firms.
Exactly.
They've opened offices in LA, they've done a lot of things. They've had the capital to be able to do the TRAN. I mean, it's great to give them opportunity, but they have to have the capital to be able to do
Yes,
it.
with all due respect, Natalie, my whole point 10 years ago and today again is
Absolutely.
a tiny firm begets a larger firm if
Absolutely.
they get the opportunity to show their stuff, and then it becomes a medium firm and then maybe even a large firm someday.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact of the matter is, the word on the street is that the city of Los Angeles is open for business with people who are good, who want to do a good job, who have a good track record, and who want to fit in the appropriate spot with the city and handle the appropriate amount of business that they can handle, like Loop. Loop couldn't handle that business before. They
No.
can today. I'm not saying they were better or worse before, but the bottom line is the city of Los Angeles is such a huge player that it has made a difference on firms throughout the country that before saw Los Angeles is not a place where they can show off their stuff and do a great job. And
Correct.
today they are.
The state of California, San Francisco have really made a difference in bringing those smaller firms along. We give ourselves a lot of credit too, but the state of California really started opening the door when Lockyer really started including all those firms, as well as us, San Francisco, San Diego. They've all have done what you said.
And with all due respect, and some of the more successful firms ended up being picked by the state of California after the
Exactly.
city of Los Angeles
Yes.
Department of Water and Power picked them to grow.
Yes.
So my point, one begets the other, and I just want to say that I think the city of Los Angeles has done a great job of today and in the last few years of making sure that we are willing to challenge responsible, capable firms. But before, we weren't exactly as robust in the variety of firms that got that opportunity. So.
I got asked to speak at the National Association of Security Professionals this year. to speak. It's basically the Association of Minority and Women Bankers, and specifically to talk about this issue. And when we walk through the numbers in terms of the number of deals that we've given to smaller firms, by far compared to both large cities and small, we were one of the most aggressive in the country, and at the same time doing really well when it comes to the deals that we're getting.
Mr. Englander?
Yeah, I just wanted to compliment you as well, and in getting us to this place. It's a great space to be at, although I think a lot of it's temporary, and hopefully, unless we continue on this path. But in reading the reports, it's phenomenal that we're able to save that. That can go directly back into whatever that might be, but yet to be determined. But at this point, we still only have a 6-month budget, really, if we look at that and the way we address the issue. But in just reading the reports as well, there's a lot of compliments in here, but there's also a lot of concern. And so what the reports say to me, particularly on the Fitch ratings report, which really goes into more depth than the other two, in talking about the potential liability, for example, on the utility users tax in the $775 million range, and all the other issues that are pending out there. It's basically saying, though, while we are holding on by a thread, we've been able to manage, but we're still holding on by a thread.
That's right.
And so hopefully the rest of our colleagues who, if we can urge them to read these reports, understand full well that we're not out of the woods by any stretch. We've just been, while we're bumping along, we're just getting along. But they've recognized our efforts, and we're being rewarded as such. We're still not in the clear, and it's not anywhere near the time to start rebuilding and spending more and not paying attention to our reserve as well. One of the interesting things that the S&P report does state is that they are very concerned with the idea that we're even discussing the elimination of the business tax. They believe, it says we, but this is their report, says we believe Los Angeles rising costs, potentially flat overall revenue, could result in a larger structural gap through the elimination of the business tax. And so they said tread lightly, be careful. So these are things I think we all have to, even when we're just having the discussions about phase out, or the discussions as we just had about the idea of categorically eliminating any kind of revenue without the immediate deliverable of replenishment of those funds, be it sales tax or bringing businesses in immediately, not just in the long run, or the idea that it would just make us look better. But we have to really look at those analysis and those reports when we ask those reports back, as we just did in the previous item, as an example on internet-based companies, is what is going to be the direct revenue benefit back to the city, and when's that going to happen? Those reports are critically important in making those determinations. But I want to applaud you, because right now we would be sitting here talking about this. We would be discussing the idea that it's costing us more had you not led us in the direction over the last several years, Miguel. So thank you. This is actually great news. But we should clap, but with only one hand.
That's right.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Cardenas.
just briefly, I'd just like to remind my colleague, well said and accurate and truthful. Can you please repeat that when you get to the full council? Because I think there are some members of the council that need to hear exactly what you said. Thank you.
Well, yes, and I want to echo both the praise and the sober caution that Mr. Englander just described. And I was going to actually ask you, Miguel, you mentioned that the reports contain kind of a to-do list to go over those, but rather than taking the time to do that, I think it was a good reminder, Mr. Englander, that all of us should take the time to review these carefully. Every member of the council really should take the time to review these reports carefully, precisely for the reason that it does give us a little bit of a roadmap for how we continue to make the progress that we're making in getting out of the fiscal emergency that we're facing. So we'll look to those reports and continue to encourage all of the members of the council and others in the city family to look at that carefully as well. But given that, I was kind of intrigued when you mentioned that some of the analysts had questions resulting from other cities' bankruptcy filings? Because to me, that doesn't make much sense. When you have the level of analysis that they're already engaged in, when you have access to all of the information that they have from this city, I can't imagine what relevance any other city's situation has on Los Angeles's condition. If anything, I would think that the more cities that are in worse shape, the better an investment we are by comparison. So how is it that what happens in another city has any bearing whatever on someone's analysis of our fiscal health?
Keep in mind that an analyst at the rating agencies and even an analyst at an investment firm is in some ways becomes our advocate when they're playing their individual roles. So we get grilled when we go meet with them, in part because they get grilled when they go to their committees, either to argue for certain ratings or to make a case that they should buy some of our bonds. And the people who are ultimately making the decision as to what the rating should be or whether they're going to purchase our debt are people who aren't as informed. And so they read San Bernardino announces bankruptcy. Okay. San Bernardino, they think, is in the county of Los Angeles or just around this corner. And by the very nature that we're in California, who has the worst bond rating in the country, it puts us under a microscope. And so they're asking these questions of all the cities that they rate that are specific to labor contracts, specific. I mean, they go as far as to, they understand, they are asking the status of our pension tier for civilians and in very specific detail. They're asking about the current year revenues, which we barely got in terms of understanding how we closed out last year. And so they're being put in a situation more than ever to provide literally a real-time assessment of how well we're doing. Even if it's to say to those investors or to their own bosses of the committee that, you know, I looked it over and they're okay. Or these are the areas of concern that we have and that are consistent with what we. So the microscope that we're under got closer several times over after San Bernardino. If they're watching whether or not we do a new pension tier, they're and understanding the details of what it means and what it doesn't mean to do it. Those are all areas where clearly, even beyond what I think most Angelenos understand in terms of how we're doing, they ask about the mayoral election in terms of just who's running and sort of what are some of the issues. So it's almost close. I've never gotten a PhD, but my guess is sort of like defending your dissertation in terms of the kind of intensity of questioning that's being asked. They listen to your council meetings, and I wouldn't be surprised if they're listening now. So
now's the time to thank them for doing an incredible job and being very
insightful analysis.
Yes, absolutely.
The rating agencies under a lot of scrutiny also after the 2008 debacle.
Right.
So one of the things that when their bosses, they're on global rating scales now, they rate everybody the same, whether you're a city or a corporation. So when the people in London and in Munich and in New York read in the newspaper about all these cities in California that are going bankrupt, quote unquote, they go to their analysts and say, what's going on in California? We need to review all the ratings.
Right.
So every single city in California is going to go through a rating review.
So that was kind of my point, because you continue to hear in the media and otherwise those who may not be as informed about this city's financial situation. They treat this as though somehow this is a contagious disease, that if one city files bankruptcy, it has some bearing on what another city's finances are, and there's no bearing whatsoever on it. Each of those cities has unique situations that gave rise to their unique situation, just like we have circumstances that give rise to where we are right now. So
in some
I
states,
just wanted to make sure that was clear, that when you talk about that, it makes sense that they need to be armed with the information to diffuse concerns that others may have about those things. That certainly is not suggestive that the fact that other municipalities have a worse situation than us suggests that somehow that's our destiny. I just want to make sure that that was clear.
I will also take the assumption that they looked at the idea of the committee structure and change and the new chair of the Budget and Finance Committee.
Oh, I have no doubt about that.
Eyebrows would have gone up. And after having reviewed the process in the committee and the great leadership of our chair, gave us some credit for that and showed us that in the
Yes, thank you. I'm sure that's gone all the way to London and Hong Kong and all the financial markets.
Well, I mean, you're not joking, because they did ask about the change in leadership, and
They did.
So it wasn't, again, these things, the one thing that we do share in common with other cities in California, which makes our job harder, is that our counterparts around the country can raise revenue. We can't. We have to go to the voters. And so ultimately, a new revenue source, it has to be part of the mix. And they understand how difficult that is in light of the economy, in light of the state, the lack of credibility, and how that ultimately, filters down to local municipalities. And so it is a unique challenge just by the virtue that we're in the state.
I'm not going to take the time to discuss it now, but Mr. Cardenas mentioned, one way of reducing the cost of the TRAN is, through more aggressive work, perhaps by our team. Another way, of course, is improving our credit rating, so that will bring costs down. But the third way is by reducing the amount that we have to borrow in the first place. And I continue to be interested in exploring ways that we can ameliorate the ups and downs of our cash flow needs in order to reduce the need for as much borrowing in the first place, if that's possible, and whether that's by restructuring the schedule by which we realize revenues, or somehow figuring a way to smooth our expenditures in a way to take care of some of those ups and downs. If there are any possibilities to do that, I continue to be interested to find ways to explore that.
I'll give one quick answer to that if you'd like. The reason why the trend grows every year has more to do with our pension costs than it has to do with our cash flow. We still get a $20 million discount by paying our pension costs in early July. And obviously, with our pension costs growing, our cash flow, unfortunately, has been fairly consistent. It hasn't been growing as much as we would like, but that is really why. And that is something we should continue looking at. Obviously, borrowing is not something we would recommend initially. Certainly, at these rates, it makes sense, but these rates won't be here forever. So thinking about it differently is something that we should definitely be doing.
All right. Thank you very much. Thanks for bringing good news, and congratulations. All right. That brings us to item number 5.
Yep. Item 5 is City Clerk report submitted in response to motion to Corrigan, Wesson, and Garcetti relative to the feasibility of adding Armenian as the language available on election ballot materials, including the costs and position analysis on a permanent basis starting with the 2013 elections.
Good afternoon.
Welcome.
Thank you, Councilman Krikorian and members of the committee. The reason we're here before you this afternoon is back in April, Council members Krikorian, Wesson, and Garcetti introduced a motion instructing our office to report on the feasibility of adding Armenian as a language on election ballot materials and to include the cost analysis. As you know, we, the City Clerk's office, are committed to fair, accessible, and transparent municipal elections, and outreach to limited English proficient voters and the disabled voters is one of our highest priorities. And it is on the top of our list always, to the extent that our budget permits, to accommodate that. I will briefly turn this, in a short amount of time, I will turn this over to Jacob Wexler, our election chief, who will strike on some major points that we presented in our report, such as the very specific definition that the feds use to determine what language shall be mandated for a county or a state, a city or a county, how we conducted our analysis of languages spoken throughout Los Angeles in comparison to Armenian, the cost breakouts of different categories of election services that we could offer in Armenian, and lastly, some challenges that could develop that could impact cost or implementation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jacob, our elections chief.
Welcome.
Good afternoon. I want to there are three issues that came up last time we had this item in committee, which was on June 4th, that we addressed in the report. And I think I wanted to start just by talking about those items specifically. And if you want to go into more details in the report, we can do that. At that time, you asked us to look at the other high-frequency languages that are also not covered by the Voting Rights Act, languages other than Armenian that also have high numbers of people who speak it in the city of LA. You asked us to look at what other jurisdictions are doing regarding providing language services in Armenian. And finally, you asked us to provide, as June said, a breakdown of options for implementation and the costs of those. And so all that's in the report. First off, as we prepared the report, we did sort of a demographic overview of the languages spoken, looking at it from the sort of same perspective that the Voting Rights Act triggers. What triggers Voting Rights Act language requirements. And we identified three main languages. Armenian is definitely the language with the highest number of people in the city of LA that isn't covered by the Voting Rights Act. Also, Persian and Russian are two other languages that also have high numbers of speakers in the city. The other highest frequency languages are already covered by the Voting Rights Act, and we already do translations for all those languages.
So for Persian, you're talking Farsi?
Yes, Persian, Farsi. The Persian is the statistical category that was in the numbers that we had. So, yes.
Persian could be broken down into Persian Jewish as well, just to be for clarity, to make sure.
It depends on whether you're speaking about the number of residents or the language. Yeah.
Right, so the language, Persian language. I understand Farsi is the right. Okay. So. So that's that issue. The second item was looking at other jurisdictions, and we looked at in the county of Los Angeles, they also provide Armenian translation services. But what they do for the county is they translate the voter information guide into Armenian, and they post that on the website. There's no distribution. It's not available at polling places, but it is available on the website for any Armenian speakers. In the city of Glendale, the other jurisdiction in LA where they provide Armenian language services, it's treated like every other language that they provide translation services for. It's a full service translation suite of services that Glendale provides. So there's different types of services that people provide in the area. Finally, we looked at the different categories of what we did in order to come up with options for language services is we basically broke down the types of language services that we provide into five broad categories, and we provided costs for each one of those categories, with the thought being that then council, because obviously we can't provide, there's no funding available in our budget to provide Armenian language services, but if you kind of get a sense of how much it costs to do different portions of the translation services, then council could decide, whether or not funding could be identified for us to pursue that this year. And just to make a note, the sooner we implement, because we're already gearing up for the March elections now, and it's a very regimented, scheduled series of events. And as we continue along, once we've done something, if we have to go back and do translations afterwards, it'll sort of have to pay for something twice. Whereas if we start early on, we can take advantage of the efficiencies of scale with translations and printing and stuff like that. So the amounts I'm going to give you are assuming that we're asked to go forward with funding in the very near future, within the next, by August 15th. We gave another estimate for December 1st, but at which point the costs have increased by about 50% overall. And after that point, we really can't provide we don't have enough time to provide those services. So the first category of services that is what we talked about actually last time in the committee, which is sort of what the voter experience is when they're voting. The official sample ballot that they receive in the mail, translating that, when they're in the voting booth, having everything translated and available for them. So the direct voter in the polling place experience. And to provide services to translate all those materials would cost $307,000.
Now, let me understand that. Is that just translation costs, or is that translation plus typesetting and printing of the alternative materials? And if it's the latter, how does it break down between translation and the printing and distribution costs? That's an awful lot of money for translation.
It's not just for translation.
Okay.
There's printing. I don't have the breakdown, but we did. Okay.
This is the entire category.
Yeah. So we have the categories, and we have the backup, which we can provide to you separately. We don't have it with us, and there's a large file with all that information.
It's not going to be urgent, given the recommendation that I'm going to make, assuming everyone agrees with my recommendation, but I would like to see how that breakdown works, because and not only for Armenian, but frankly for the other languages, because if there's a significant translation cost, then maybe there's an issue that we have to have a staff enhancement for your staff to have people in-house, which would translate it probably less expensively than this. But
no, it's not just translation. It's also printing and mailing to people who request those.
And some of programming too, such as into the ABB,
Right, that's a part of it.
Some of it is
also.
non-written, but it's...
Oh, actually, we do have the backup. Printing, actually, it's printing and translations. So it's both. So in terms of having it broken down, we can get that information for you.
okay, I'll follow up with you on that.
Yeah. The second category of services that we looked at is the vote by mail services, and that's basically, we don't send out translated materials, but we have it available for people upon request, and we have information in the inserts in the person's language saying you can call this number for further assistance. So we would provide that level of service for Armenian would cost about $48,000.
So now just, again, so I understand that would mean that people get their VBM application. It has a line in there is printed in the foreign language, whatever it may be, that if you would like additional materials in this language, they're available to you? Is that how it works?
Yeah, that's what they receive now for their languages, and then we have the instructions. We have to translate the materials that we would send them. The instructions are available.
In the mandatory languages. We get it now. So right now, it's only in the federally mandated languages, and it appears there. And then if they call in or email you, then you provide them with translated materials?
That's correct. Yeah, and we have, let's see, the instructions. Yeah, the instructions are only provided upon request, and we also have the application for vote by mail available in multiple languages. So there's so that's distributed to some degree as well. So that all the vote by mail components.
So we could do, if we wanted to do B, we would still
the line. You mean?
Yeah. Well, just to think it through, if you were to add another language to that vote by mail material, you would still have to do the translation and preparation of the materials that are contained in A in order to do that, because if they called in, you would have to have it at the ready.
Exactly. That was
So
our logic.
you can't do B without doing A.
We didn't feel that would be, otherwise they could call in and we could, talk to them on the telephone.
Right. Okay.
Right. The third category of services is just the polling place signage. So when you go to a polling place, you see it, curbside voting or vote here, the materials on the table, the kiosk where people are told no electioneering, things like that. So all the materials that you see on the walls, and there's translation and printing costs. The cost of that is $6,000 just to kind of add that language to the materials that are visible in the polling place. Fourth category is poll worker recruitment. What this is basically doing some research to determine what areas of the city would need to be targeted with bilingual Armenian poll workers, because and then we'd go out and recruit poll workers who have those linguistic skills and assign them to those precincts. And the cost of that are $38,000 to provide those. And the final category is outreach. This is the flyers and posters that you may see around newspaper ads, going to events. I think this also includes hiring bilingual staff available to staff those types of events and support those translation services. And the cost of doing our outreach for one additional language is $71,000. So those are the 5 categories of services. I can probably wrap it up there and be available for questions.
And what would be included in the outreach component of that? What sorts of things would that entail? I mean, I read what's included in the report, but I'm trying to get a sense of what that means.
Right. So it's really, like I said, there's a lot of just sort of, we put newspaper ads out there. We have posters that we put up in libraries or things like that. So there's producing and translating those materials that we would do otherwise and posting them. Obviously the cost of posting them are already included, but the translation cost of that. We could do, I think we included the cost of a public service announcement in Armenian.
Okay.
Newspaper advertisements in Armenian.
So that outreach, okay, I'm going to signal my pass here. Here's what I'm going to suggest, because it's a lot of money to bite off at one time, and I think it's an important direction that we move in. This is the 3rd most commonly spoken language in the city among those who are not fully conversant in English, the 3rd most common in the entire city. So I think this is an important step that we need to take. I think to put your office under the pressure of trying to get this all done by the time of this upcoming election is a lot to ask of you, frankly. And so what I think I would propose is that we move forward with the poll worker recruitment and the outreach component of this at this time, and that we plan for a 2015 introduction of the other items on this, the actual translation of the materials. And one of the advantages in doing that is that one of the challenges that you have now in preparing translated material in a non-mandated language is that we have throughout California voter registration forms that provide the checkoff box there for the mandated languages for people who need help, but we don't have that in the non-mandated languages, and so you have you have a challenge in trying to identify who the electorate is that will need this. So I think if you have a couple years of lead-in, which includes poll worker recruitment, which includes outreach to the community to try to encourage people to come forward and identify themselves as needing this kind of language assistance, then you have a body of information from which you can plan a sensible transition in time for the 2015 election.
I would agree with that. Also, it allows us time to coordinate our efforts with LA County Registrar Recorder, who is the person that takes care of registered voters and how they develop their materials, because right now there's a disconnect. Right. Or a discrepancy. If we add Armenian, and they do it, on a scale that's a lot smaller than ours, we don't want there to be a confusion in the Armenian community. Why do I get one ballot in Armenian and I don't in the other, and they don't make a difference between a county election and a city election.
And that was going to be also part of my recommendation, that we collaborate with the county, with the city of Glendale, with the city of Burbank, which also has a significant Armenian population, and try to identify not only how to collaborate more strategically, as you've indicated, Madam Clerk, but also whether there might be cost efficiencies that can be realized collectively by pursuing a common goal here. I don't know if there are or not, but when it comes to translation services or in some other way, printing services, the actual process of printing in a language that doesn't include English characters, those are all sorts of areas where there might be cost efficiencies in collaborating with some of the other surrounding government entities. So that would be part of my recommendation as well. Mr. Englander, did you have something to? Okay.
How do you say thank you in Armenian?
Shnuragalachen. So if that makes sense to you, that would be, oh, thought we were We're
Holly
getting clean
Walcott.
getaway.
I'm completely on board with your recommendation. I just need to know where the funds are coming from.
Minor details. Jeez. Antics. I thought we were anti.
Yes, thank you. And I think what I'd like to do is, rather than initiating a reserve fund transfer right now, since we've reduced this down to a little over $100,000 now, I'm not going to recommend a reserve fund transfer at this time, but that can come later if we need to, depending upon what surplus there may be, because your budget in particular is highly variable, and especially now with the neighborhood council elections and transition, and the fact that we're preparing for another election. Let's see how we do on that. And
would this be something that we work with the CAO maybe in their FSR process?
I think that would be the best way to handle it.
We'll be happy to work with the city clerk.
Rather than recommending reserve fund transfer at this time. So
We already squeezed you.
I would propose then that the recommendation of this committee would be to move forward with recommendations 1, E, and F, and recommendation number 3, which directs the city clerk to include Armenian language services as part of its budget request for the 2015 municipal elections, and not including the approval of the reserve fund transfer at this time. Okay?
Wonderful. Good.
Any objections? All right. Without objection, that'll be the action of the committee. Thank you very much for your good work on this. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you so much.
It's important progress that we're making. All right. And with that, we have concluded the agenda items. I still don't have any public comment cards, which I think may be a first. So with that, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you all very much.
I think just one note on item 6, note and file.
Yes.